Greetings from Epiphany. Significant events in geopolitics unfold and revolve around strategic choke points. These narrow and congested geographical areas are difficult to travel or navigate, and hence affect their trading and combating ability. In instances of crisis, countries usually influence these choke points and obstruct the flow of resources or military in order to push the opponents on a back foot. In this video, we shall be looking at 4 of the most important strategic choke points of the world with their historical background and economic repercussions. The Strait of Malacca. A group of islands with a total area of more than 8,000 square kilometers, located about 2,500 kilometers away from the national capital, is directly administered by the central government of the country, even though the country has constitutional provisions to establish state governments. However, this is not the only union territory of India, as she has 7 other such centrally administered regions. Although different regions have different reasons, the idea behind the Andaman and Nicobar Islands is highly strategic. In fact, it is partly the same as to why China is building artificial islands in the South China Sea. If one observes the geography of East Asia, the South China Sea region is surrounded by countries like China, Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, Vietnam, and Indonesia. All of them claim rights over different regions of the sea. As per the United Nations Convention on Law of the Seas, or simply the UN clause, every country has an exclusive economic right over water bodies up to a distance of 200 nautical miles from its shore. A country can take up various economic activities, including recovering valuable resources from beneath the sea. However, China has a dispute over its jurisdiction in the South China Sea with almost all countries. China has built artificial islands in the South China Sea and under the UN Convention claims solemn right over an area extending up to 200 nautical miles from these islands. China has chosen to extend its presence over the South China Sea primarily for 2 reasons. China imports about $40 billion worth of oil from Saudi Arabia every year. So one of the reasons is that the South China Sea is extremely rich in natural resources and will provide energy security to China in times of both peace and war. Apart from these oil imports, majority of China's trade flows through the Strait of Malacca. The Strait of Malacca is a strategic choke point between Singapore and Indonesia, which is less than 3 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. The artificial islands bring Chinese forces close to the Strait of Malacca, so that in case of any conflict, China would not want to lose any valuable time in reaching the point of crisis around the strait. The Strait of Malacca lies at a close proximity to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, adding strategic importance to the archipelago. Major trade routes pass through this strait, enabling trade worth trillions of dollars every year. In case of any crisis or conflict, there is an understandable paranoia amongst every country regarding the intentions of the other to blockade their supplies. Hence, every country tries to maintain an influence around the strait. The Strait of Hormuz. In June 2019, a Japanese and a Norwegian ship carrying oil supplies were attacked in a region that witnesses the flow of over a fifth of world's oil supplies. This region is surrounded by countries whose economies are majorly dominated by oil exports. Saudi Arabia, Iran, Qatar, UAE, Kuwait, and Iraq rely on the peace in this region to ensure the shipment of oil from their countries. The Strait of Hormuz is just over 160 kilometers long and at its narrowest point is just under 40 kilometers wide. As per the UN Convention, nations can have up to 12 nautical miles of water from their coast as territorial waters. Hence, Iran and Oman have the entire jurisdiction over the strait. However, the convention also promotes peaceful passage of ships even on territorial waters. The attacks around the Strait of Hormuz were not claimed by any of the state actors, as against the open threats issued by a few leaders about such an act. However, the ambitions to control the shipment artery go as long back in history as the evolution of oil economy itself. The war between Iran and US-backed Iraq that lasted almost an entire decade of 1980 saw both sides trying to block each other's oil supplies. After the fall of Shah Pahlavi in 1979 and the subsequent hostage of US nationals in Iran, the friendly relations between the US and Iran took a hit. The relationship saw an abysmal low in 1988 when the US accidentally hit a civilian aircraft after mistaking it for a fighter jet, killing over 290 individuals, including about 66 kids. The United States sees Iran's nuclear ambitions as a threat to the overall stability of the region. Accordingly, it has taken steps to dissuade the supreme leader from taking any steps in that direction. After a series of sanctions over the years, finally, in 2015, a historic deal was signed between all the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council and Germany, jointly regarded as the P5+1, along with the European Union and Iran, called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or popularly known as the Iran Nuclear Deal. As per the agreement, the US would lift its sanctions and Iran would limit its nuclear program. With Trump's decision to withdraw America from the deal and impose economic sanctions on Iran, the Strait of Hormuz attained visible importance again. The Strait of Gibraltar. Why would the UK, an empire that at one point in time was so colossal that the sun would never set on it, hold on to a piece of land so small that it would be a shame to its past glory? A land whose 96% population voted against the Brexit owing to fears of isolation, as it is about 3,000 kilometers away from the Great Britain. The answer to this question was obvious to the pundits of geopolitics, but in 2019 it became apparent to everyone. A tanker carrying Iranian oil to Syria was stopped around Spain's coast by British marine officials stationed in Gibraltar. Britain did so as Iran had violated the ban placed by the EU on oil supplies to Syria. But there was something peculiar about this detention. Europe had placed a ban on oil shipments to Syria since 2011 as a move to express its conservations against the Assad regime, but never did it take a step in seizing a tanker. Then why would the British Royal Marine take such an action after over 8 years? To understand that, let's go back to the Iran deal. The US pulled out of the Iran deal in 2018 and also legislated a seemingly draconian law against the Islamic Republic a year ago, in order to impose economic sanctions on Iran to force it to completely zero down its nuclear program. Iran then put the responsibility on other signatories of the Iran deal to persuade the US to abide by its side of the deal. As per international reports, Iran had until then not violated the restrictions imposed on it. Iran thought that as a signatory of the deal, the P5+1 countries along with the EU have a responsibility to enforce the provisions of the deal and make sure that others follow it too, taking a jibe at the US. After the economic sanctions tightened the noose around Iran's neck, and as its key importers, including India, started zeroing down its oil imports from Iran, Iran threatened attacking oil tankers near the Gulf of Oman in order to put counter pressure on the NATO allies and the signatories of the nuclear deal. After a series of attacks on oil tankers near Strait of Hormuz that threatened the security of a few European countries, there are fair chances that the EU took this step as a measure of retaliation against Iran. As matters escalated, Iran seized a British tanker a couple of weeks later. You guessed it right, near the Strait of Hormuz. It nonetheless claimed that the seizure was not a tit-for-tat move, but a penalty for not complying with international maritime laws. The Suez Canal. Former Prime Minister of Canada, Lester Pearson, who was then the Secretary of State for External Affairs, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1957 for resolving a conflict that was on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, around a small piece of land in Asia called the Sinai Peninsula, a part of present-day Egypt. Pearson had ideated commissioning UN peacekeeping forces around a canal that was built just a century ago. The UN peacekeeping force was to stay at the canal until both the Egyptian and the Israeli governments agreed on its withdrawal. After the Suez Canal was opened in 1869, the traffic in the initial years was lower than expected. As a result, the Ottoman Empire had to sell off majority of its stakes to the British Empire in 1875. With Egypt's independence in 1922, British hoped to retain its control over the Suez Canal, as it was important for the flow of goods between its various colonies. In 1936, the Egyptian monarch struck a deal with the British Empire over the Suez Canal, allowing the British to station forces to protect the surrounding areas of the Suez Canal and its economic assets passing through. As the monarch was overthrown in Egypt during the initial 1950s, a strong sentiment arose of taking over the control of the Suez Canal and making it a property of the public. Finally, in 1957, with the support from the Soviet forces, the new ruler of Egypt, General Nasser, took over the control of the Suez Canal and transferred its ownership to a governmental organization. Britain and France were hugely hurt by this move. Israel, A nascent country to the east of Egypt was also upset with Egypt for blockading the Strait of Tiran, which was Israel's only maritime route to the Indian Ocean. Finally, towards the end of 1956, Israel, Britain and France attacked Egypt in the bid to take back the Suez. The conflict immediately became a proxy battleground for the US and the USSR, with the USSR threatening to nuke Western Europe if they did not withdraw. The US President Dwight Eisenhower condemned the Soviet leader by asking him not to get involved in the conflict, but at the same time, he was not very happy with the actions of the three countries either. Finally, after economic pressures from the US, Britain and France chose to withdraw from the region, marking the end of the Suez crisis. Later, the peacekeeping forces were sent to cool off the air between Egypt and Israel. So these were the significant choke points of the world. But in India's regional geopolitics, there is another crucial choke point called the Siliguri corridor. And we have addressed this topic in an article on our website. So do check out the link in the description box to read about it and much more. If you like what we do, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more such videos.